Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final episode of the MiCEF Let's Talk Transmission podcast. My name is Chris Kerber, and I am a research fellow with the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum. Our organization is dedicated to promoting common sense, market-based energy policies that foster competition, diversification, and continued technological advancement. We work to reduce economic and political barriers to energy innovation through education, research, policy advocacy, and collaborative partnerships, ensuring all customers have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy for homes, businesses, and transportation. Today I was joined by Jim MacInnes, CEO of Chrystal Mountain Resort and member of the MiCEF Leadership Council. I have had a absolutely fantastic time getting to know Jim over the past couple of months over my time with MiCEF. And he is just a wealth of knowledge and has truly led an astounding career. So I hope you guys enjoy listening to today's episode just as much as I enjoyed filming it. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here with you, Chris.
So you just have such an amazing background and you've led such an interesting career within energy and transmission. And I know we've talked about it before, away from the podcast, but could you just go over that for our viewers so they can all get an idea of just all the stuff that you've done?
Well, I can give you a quick version. I actually started out becoming very interested in electricity and magnetism in the Cub Scouts. That's probably what got me started. And then I ended up working for Pacific Telephone in central office switching for a while, which was kind of like the old electromechanical computer systems. And I served in the Navy as a radio operator on an ammunition ship in Vietnam. And then went to engineering school and studied electrical engineering at the University of California at Irvine.
Mm-hmm.
And decided that, there's a lot of different aspects of electrical engineering. It's probably 36 different societies within the EE program. And I decided to get involved in energy. And so that was pretty interesting. I ended up after graduating from engineering school, going to work for a company called Ebasco Services. And Ebasco was a large utility architectural and engineering firm headquartered out of 2 Rector Street in New York City. And they designed and managed, construction managed power plant projects all over the world, really, including one here in Michigan that's pretty well known. It's called the Ludington Pump Storage Plant. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was about 1,800 megawatts, something like that, better known as 1.8 gigawatts. And it was brought online in 1973. So Ebasco designed that, and it's funny. I've toured the plant 4 times. It's pretty fun to look at the diagrams because I was a controls engineer for them, and I was looking at all the control. They call them CWDs, control wiring diagrams, that we used to use back in the day. So I did that. I worked on various proposals for the Department of Energy. We did a lot of projects at Ebasco. I was there about 3 years. One of the things we did was we helped write the nuclear power plant emergency response plan for the state of California, the first one. And that was pretty interesting. We got involved with plume modeling and communication, how you communicate with everybody throughout the state if there was an incident. And then I ended up going to a different company called Ultra Power. And what they did is they developed, designed, constructed, partially owned and operated renewable energy plants. And we did a lot of plants in Northern California. These were mostly biomass power plants, about anywhere from 12 to 25 megawatts in size. And I worked for them as a controls engineer for a while, and then ended up being involved in power plant development. So I used, it would take me several years to develop a project. This company was headquartered in Irvine, California, and I would fly up to Northern California every week and spend 3 or 4 days there and attend public hearings. And one time I rented the basketball stadium in Cloverdale, which is the northernmost incorporated city in Sonoma County.
Mhm.
And we had a hearing with 350 people talking about how a power plant works, how, the impacts of power plants and how it fits into the grid and all of that. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And then I got involved in financing power plants and working with the banks and things like that, which turned out to be very useful for me. After I left Ultra Power, I came to work in a family business here in Michigan called Chrystal Mountain.
Mhm.
And one of the first things I did when I came here was to refinance the resort. So, which I've done. I think I've done 8 financings since I've been at Chrystal. So that's kind of where my career has taken me, and it's been a lot of fun, really. I really enjoy energy, and I've enjoyed the recreation and tourism business too. Being outdoors, it's kind of in now. Being outside is in. People
Right.
like we were talking about that earlier, and
Mhm.
ski, and bike, and all that stuff. So it's a nice field to be in these days.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so while you were in Michigan, I know that you also spent some time with the Michigan Utility Consumer Participation Board. Could you talk a little bit about your time with that organization and the role that that organization serves in Michigan?
Yeah, that was a very interesting time. I was involved with that for about 10 years. I was appointed by Governor Snyder as chair of the UCPB. And I wasn't that familiar with what it did, but basically it represented the interests of residential ratepayers in electric and gas utility rate cases. So our goal was to try to help policy with the utilities and help to control the costs. Michigan has long had the highest residential rates in the country, or not so much in the country, but in the Midwest, but
Mhm.
among the top in the country. And so we tried to figure out ways to keep the rates better controlled, and we funded interveners. So there would be various organizations that would come to us and with proposals to take on the utilities and various rate cases, and we have to study all these cases and decide how we want to invest the funds. And the funds basically came from all of us, as electricity users. We paid about 1 or 2 cents a month into this fund, all of us, and so we had about 700,000 a year, which really was not enough. I tried to get that increase, but it was it was difficult. Did get some more money, but it took a while to do that. But it was very interesting because it got us involved with a lot of different aspects of the utility business and types of power plants and what their plans were, how they spend their money. And we would bring in expert accountants and engineers and policy people. And so it was very interesting time.
Sure. And so now with your time at Crystal Mountain, you're still very, interested and involved with energy, specifically, electric transmission. Why are you still so interested in the topic? And maybe why should, other consumers and small businesses be interested as well?
Well, one of the reasons I'm interested in it is because we're a large power user at Crystal Mountain. When we make snow, we use almost 5 megawatts of power, and we consume about 6 million kilowatt hours a year. So we've got a pretty big power bill.
Mhm.
It's over $500,000 a year. So that'll certainly get your attention to start with. And also, being in the ski business, we're concerned about global warming And, the climate is warming and we're seeing the impacts, and it's not good when you're in the ski business and the temperature is warming. So because of that, we've had to invest millions of dollars in snowmaking and even this year, for example, we're investing $250,000 in snowmaking upgrades so that we can make more snow in a shorter period of time when the temperatures drop.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of business reasons. I'm a business person, and we have this year we had 1,000 W-2s. We had $20 million payroll. We have a lot of people, a lot of things going on at Chrystal Mountain, and we want it to continue to be successful. And our energy use is, I mean, in terms of our total cost, it's not a huge part of our total cost, but if you don't have energy, you shut down. I mean, it powers everything. So
Right.
it's really important. We also have LP gas. We use about 300,000 gallons of LP gas each year. So there's a lot of business reasons to be interested in energy, and then of course we're in an energy transitioning from a lot of large power plants that are aging out. Basically, they're being shut down, and so this is a natural time to look at alternatives and see if we can clean up the grid. And of course, an important part of that is transmission. And so, and also, I've been interested in science my whole life,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very interesting to see how this is all playing out and what the opportunities are. But basically, what's happening is we're moving from, let's say, a few thousand large power plant equivalents throughout the country to maybe hundreds of thousands of smaller power plants they're called distributed energy resources, DERs.
Mm-hmm.
They're spread out all throughout the country, and even people have them on their house. They have solar panels on their house. There are small community solar projects, and even utility scale plants, such as wind and solar plants, are really much smaller than a lot of these large scale plants that we've had in the past, like nuclear plants or coal plants. So think about, we have fewer large plants. We've built the transmission system around servicing fewer large plants. And now we're going to have 10 or 100 times more smaller plants. So, the only way it'll work is we have to connect them. And we will be connecting them with more transmission and distribution. And I talk a lot about transmission, but really distribution is really critical too.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of reasons to be interested in it, and that's what gets my attention.
Sure. Sure. So you started to touch on this when you were talking about kind of the transformation we're seeing from a very decentralized or a very conglomerate generation model to a more decentralized one. What are some of the other changes that are occurring within the industry?
Well, I think we're going from fossil fuel type plants to renewable plants, which are typically smaller and operate fewer hours in a given year.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is we can predict pretty much when the sun is going to shine and the wind's going to blow. It's not perfect, but we're pretty good at it. We've gotten quite sophisticated at it. So that's a change. I do think we're going to continue to see interest in nuclear power, because nuclear power plants are really, they can really are quite reliable. They're online a lot and they can produce a lot of bulk power. So I think we're probably going to be seeing more nuclear, although I think it's going to be more in smaller, what they call SMRs, small modular reactors, rather than big, like I used to live near what they call San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. It was south of San Clemente, California.
Mm-hmm.
And they had two large power plants there, each about 1,000 megawatts. And we're going to be switching away from those 1,000 megawatt plants, I think, and going with smaller, maybe maybe 50 to 250 or 300 megawatt smaller plants, smaller modular reactors, which are safer. That seems to be the direction that we're headed. We're not there, we're just in the very early stages. So, but that does seem to be progressing. We're also going from large rotating machines, steam turbine generators. We're switching over to generation that is connected to the grid via inverters, like smart inverters. And these inverters, these types of generating resources are called inverter-based resources, IBRs. So we're switching over from large rotating machines to IBRs. That's a huge transition. And it has some challenges and some benefits. One of the things about a large rotating machine is it can take a few seconds to respond. Let's say a large power plant trips, it might take 3 or 4 or 5 seconds for another power plant that would be a spinning reserve, let's say, to ramp up and be able to cover the missing power there. Where an inverter type project, providing it has the capacity, and it could be multiple plants that would do this, they can respond in like 4/1000th of a second. It can be really quick. So that's an advantage. But there's going to be a lot of programming, and they have what are called grid forming inverters, which are pretty sophisticated. And there's a lot of work being done on how you implement those so that when you have a large percentage of inverter-based resources, that they all can work together. They can coordinate together in making sure that the lights stay on. That's not an easy task. There's a lot of work that has to be done on that yet, but that seems to be the direction we're headed. And basically these inverters sit on the grid and they look at the power needs of the grid, both real power, which does work, and reactive power, which provides the magnetizing current for the transformers and the motors. Mm-hmm. And when the voltage or when the frequency drops, it means there's not enough real power and you need to add power, and they can determine that autonomously. So you don't really have to have somebody in a central control center telling you, hey, we need more megawatts or megavars if there's a voltage dip, because reactive power supports the voltage. So these things can do things autonomously, which, when you think about the concerns we've had over cybersecurity and that sort of thing, being able to run our power system, the more we can do that reliably but autonomously, that could be a real advantage for us in terms of cybersecurity. So there are a lot of things going on really in the transition.
Right. Yeah. So with all these very, wide changes that are happening within the overall energy industry, how does the transmission grid specifically need to change in order to accommodate all these different things?
Well, that's a good question. I think, the grid has been built out, I guess you might call haphazardly. I don't think people would argue with me on that. Over the decades, really, and so a lot of, just like the power plants are aging out, the grid is aging out too in its own way, and wires need to be replaced, put in, more capacity in some areas, and add substations in other areas, and more distribution lines. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done on upgrading the grid. And just simply because it's needs to be replaced. I mean, things do age, and whether it's resorts or power plants or power grids, they all need to be maintained.
Right.
It's it's everything goes to its high. It's kind of like the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, where everything goes to its highest state of disorder, unless you put energy in it to reorder it and get it back to its good state, so to speak. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is we have some opportunities to build what's called a high voltage DC macro grid, which would be an overlay grid on, that's over and above the existing grid. And it could be as high as 1,000,000 volts. And it can send bulk power long distances with a very low loss. And it's not really a new technology. When I was in engineering school 45 years ago, we toured what's still called the Pacific Intertie. It was an interconnection, 800,000 volt connection between Celilo, Oregon, and Sylmar, California, out in the LA. And we toured at either end, they have what are called converter stations. And back then they used mercury arc valves that glowed in the dark. It was kind of like being in a spaceship. It was quite something. But we got a chance to tour that. And they could basically send a nuclear power plant worth of electricity up to Oregon and vice versa.
Wow.
We were in the control room, and I mean, this has been around for over 50 years, this technology. And now these converter stations have become much more efficient. As an example, in China, there is a transmission line that was energized in 2019 that can send 12 nuclear power plants worth of electricity, 2,000 miles, with a loss of less than 5%.
Wow.
It's a million volt transmission line, and it sends it a long way, and it's very efficient. When you go with high voltage, your resistance losses are much less. And so you can really keep the overall losses down. So I see us at least, I think, starting to do, and actually I think there was recently a high voltage DC line that was approved between, I think it was Arizona and California, and you're going to see more and more of these high voltage DC lines moving bulk power between regions very efficiently. And so what that allows us to do is take advantage of geographic diversity between the types of the different plants. So when it's windy here and it's not windy there, or sunny here or not sunny, you can take advantage of bringing in the power from where it's being generated, and you can also take advantage of time diversity, because the load on each in each area is different. There's a different load in Michigan than there is in Arizona in terms of the time that the load peaks. So you can take advantage of these time zone changes and move power where it needs to be. So that's a huge advantage. And so I think you're going to start seeing more high voltage DC lines connected, and I think that's going to be a good addition for the grid.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to take a little bit of a step back, when we look at the overall electricity ecosystem, if you will, why is transmission, as opposed, maybe not opposed to, but with generation and distribution, why is transmission so important right now and being, talked about on the national level?
Well, with more plants, you need to connect them. You've got many more smaller plants that need to be connected. And, we just need to add transmission to do that. And also, it's difficult to get transmission permitted, because while an awful lot of people want clean energy and want to support nature, a lot of people are not interested in looking at a transmission tower. And so there's been a lot of talk about that, and how can we get transmission approved, because it's really, it's just physics. It's the flow of electricity, and it's driven by the laws of physics, and you need to have this transmission. One of the ways we can actually reduce some of the transmission is we can add more storage, and I think that's being considered. The Ludington Pump Storage Plant now, that's 2 nuclear power plant equivalents. And so that can store energy, and because of that, you don't need, that kind of reduces the amount of transmission needed. You also can have what are called virtual power plants. And virtual power plants would mean, for example, the utilities could send out a signal and shut off my hot water heater. One of my hot water heaters is electric. So, or shut off the refrigerator, shut off your air conditioning, at certain times during the peak. And so that becomes, so those of us who use electricity, we can actually help to create a virtual power plant and reduce the demand, which is actually can be really quickly implemented,
Mhm.
and for people who sign up, and it's the equivalent of adding more generation. So you've got that as well. So there are a few other things we can do, but we still, if you look at the studies, we still are going to need a lot more transmission, even when we implement some of these other additions.
Sure. So as the national conversations surrounding transmission have started to kick off, we have started to see, more transmission lines and more projects get proposed and approved. For example, MISO's LRTP Tranche 1, for example. So how do we try and, yield these benefits of transmission and continue to invest in transmission while also balancing that with customer affordability?
Well, affordability is certainly certainly important, as I learned in my 10 years as chair of the UCPB. I do think that, things are, I mean, we've gone a long time with fairly stable electricity rates. And we want to do that as long as we can. But on the other hand, when you, well, I mean, look at the price of houses. When you got your first house, it was at a certain level, but to replace that house today because of inflation, it's more expensive. And so uh, the fact is we are going to have to replace these power plants, whether we replace them with coal plants or with clean energy plants. And so there's going to be an increased cost. And that's just, I mean, that's whether you replace your car, your house, or whatever, we are looking at increased costs. Now, I would say that the utilities, in my view, can do more. They can encourage more energy waste reduction, which is something Governor Snyder was really big on. And, I think about everybody agrees that if we can cut our, insulate the homes and cut our demand, that's some of the cheapest power that we could get.
Mhm.
So we need to be investing in energy waste reduction, I think, a lot more. And we also need to be able to import power. In the past, utilities, in my experience, have been reluctant to import power because, the way the system is designed, that if they build $1 billion power plant, they can put it in the rate base. And with a transmission, if you import power from other areas, it's more difficult to get a return on that. And so we're probably going to have to do quite a bit of work to be able to allow the utilities to make a fair return even when power is imported using transmission. So, I expect to see rates continuing to go up, but I think we need to hold the utilities accountable more. Um, and that's a difficult thing because of the utilities, as I mentioned to you earlier, have a lot of sway. They have a lot of control. They're big and they have a lot of lobbying capability, and they can impact governance and all over the country, really. And so it's a balance. We have to balance the interest of the ratepayer with the interest of the shareholder,
Mhm.
which is tricky for the public, whether it's the Michigan or any public service commission to do. Now, one of the things I will say is that if you have a municipality or a co-op, in those two cases, unlike the investor-owned utilities, their interests are much more aligned with the ratepayers. In other words, they don't have the shareholders, this other group called shareholders, that they have to worry about as much. I mean, obviously they have to keep the lights on, but they are much more aligned with the ratepayers. The co-ops are, and the municipalities. So, and we're served by a co-op, Chairland Electric. And it's nice. I mean, I kind of feel like when I talk to them, they're on my side. They want more reliable electricity, and they want to keep the rates down as
Mhm.
best they can. to do that. So I think we're going to see more activity with the co-ops and munis. Basically, I think that could be a good direction for us. But we're still going to need the large power providers with the investor-owned utilities.
Right. So to kind of zoom out again, when we talk about transmission in general and the transmission industry, what do we see as some of the most significant opportunities and challenges as we really start to, evaluate what we're going to need to accommodate these changes and address changes that we might see in the future?
Well, getting back to this, well, there are a few things. We basically have three grids in the US. We have the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and the Texas grid. And in between these three grids, there's what's called a seam. And for example, the Eastern grid is about 700 gigawatts worth of, somewhere 750 gigawatts worth of capacity in the Eastern grid. And that goes all the way out to Colorado and Montana and that area. And, crosses the country. I mean, there's a seam between that and the Western grid. The Western grid has a capacity of about 350 gigawatts. So you've got 700 gigawatts and 350 gigawatts. And then there is a seam between them. And the capacity of the seam, it's got 7 different connections.
Mm-hmm.
Total, only 1.3 gigawatts. So think of that, 700, 350. There's a little tiny ability to move power across the seam. And so that's really held us back. And, being able to share power to be able to use, to have better asset utilization. The way you have a better return, I can say this in the resort business, the more that we can use our assets, keep them busy, the better off we're going to be. And to the extent that there were better connections between the Eastern and Western grids, those transmission or those generator assets could be more, used more, which will provide, which will lower the cost overall, because it'll take, when you have more generators available, you don't have to build as many new ones, for example. And then also with ERCOT is about 70 or 75 gigawatts. And they have, because they wanted to remain independent of the federal regulation as much as possible, they have they really don't have much in the way of interconnection with the other two grids either. And I think that's been one of their problems and why they've had huge issues with when it gets cold down there. And there've been a lot of issues, one of which is that they didn't design their plants to operate in cold temperatures. And so their gas plants and their other plants, fossil fuel plants, freeze up. Basically. That's been known for more than a decade. I can show you articles from Power Magazine back in 2014 about what should have been done to make that area more reliable. But so interconnecting the three grids, I think, is a terrific opportunity that we have, and that's been studied. It's been kicked around since the mid '60s. This is not a new concept. So I really think, and whether it's high voltage DC or just AC or whatever it is, I think there's a real opportunity there. The other thing I think is with distribution, or the distribution system and the substations. If we're going to have more electric vehicle charging stations, more solar plants on people's homes, which I think that's an opportunity. We need to increase the cap on the ability for homeowners to have their own solar projects. And that will reduce some of the need for transmission right there. But you also have to make sure that the distribution system is capable of handling that, and the interface between a homeowner and the distribution system. Also, we have the EV charging, and that's going to be another big item. So, there's a lot going on with this, the whole transmission concept. But going to clean energy. I mean, going to electrifying the country more. I mean, in 2021, the US used about 97 quadrillion BTU of electricity, of energy, of which 2/3 of it was wasted. It just went up in heat. And so the more we can electrify, you don't have that problem. It's, when you create that electricity, you can put almost all of it to work without waste heat. So there's a lot of opportunities for us.
Absolutely. And then did you have any challenges that you wanted to touch on?
Challenges as far as,
Just to transmission in general as we look towards the future.
I think the biggest challenge, well, we've got to fund it, but just like we'd have to fund new power plants, we're going to have to fund transmission. I think the biggest challenge we have right now is permitting. And both, at the local level, I think the utilities are not always excited about having transmission, bringing in power from another state, for example. And so we've got some entrenched interests that, whether it be people who don't want to look at towers, or utilities that don't want to import energy because they'd rather build $1 billion fossil fuel plant and put it in the rate base. I think the funding but basically I think the biggest issue by far is the permitting. I think there's plenty of capital available to fund this, and it wouldn't be government. I mean, I think there's plenty of private capital available to build transmission, but we have to be able to get it permitted. And the way things are set up, it can just take one little planning commission in one community to stop a line that might go 1,000 miles. That's I would say by far the biggest issue.
Perfect, thank you. And so we have to talk about the peninsula problem, because you and I, away from the podcast, have had some great conversations on this before. And during the first episode of this podcast, Chairman Scripps and I talked about it as well. Could you start off by just giving us an overview of the peninsula problem here in Michigan, and then some of your ideas for tackling that problem?
Well, we're surrounded. The good news is we're surrounded by 20% of the world's fresh water. That's really a great asset for us, but it also makes it difficult to move electricity. And so we pretty much have to move, come from the bottom up, which, it's nice to have a diverse supply coming from all sides. Like if you're in the central part of the US, you'll be able to, like Southwest Power Pool, which is on the other side of the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator on the western side, they're connected on all sides, and it really makes it much easier to move power around they have more choices to where. For us, it's difficult. We can't really send power across Lake Michigan or Lake Huron very well. And the UP, there is a connection between the UP and the north and the lower peninsula, but it's very small. It's only about 40 megawatts, something like that. And actually, there's a high voltage DC converter station there called the St. Ignace Converter Station. It's rated at about 225 megawatts. And they don't really use it for bulk power, long distance bulk power transmission. What they use it for is to stabilize the power, the wires going across the lower part of the upper peninsula, so that you can actually send more real power and you can provide the reactive power locally with this converter station. So these converter stations have a couple of different things they can do, but anyway, so it's hard to get power across Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, the Straits of Mackinac. I mean, we don't have a lot of power plants up in the upper peninsula either. So most of it has to come from below, from, let's say, Indiana or Ohio or Illinois, through Illinois and all that. So that makes it difficult. And as you said, there is this Tranche 1 project that was approved that's actually going to bring power from, wind energy, among other things, from Iowa up from the bottom up to the transmission lines, the east-west transmission line in the southern part of the state, which is going to be terrific. I've been advocating for that for something like that for a decade, and I'm so glad to see. I mean, I'm really glad to see that that's going to happen.
Mhm.
So, in terms of solutions, I think the problem with AC is you can't really send AC more than about 25 miles underwater. It just it's not feasible, but you can send DC long distances underwater. It's just not affected by the water. And so we have opportunities. I know that Wolverine Power and and I think MISO is looking at a transmission line between Wisconsin and the Ludington Pump Storage Plant. And it may be years or decades out, who knows? But I think there's been some discussion about moving power that way.
Mhm.
And the Ludington plant it's served by 3 major transmission lines, so it would be a good node to connect into that area. And so that's one possibility. Another possibility, and this would be a high voltage DC line under Lake Michigan. And that's how that would be transmitted. Another possibility, and I've spoken with Hydro-Quebec has a tremendous amount of hydropower available that they would like to export and get paid for. I've talked with Hydro-Quebec power engineers about it, and actually they are selling more and more power to the U.S., but there would be an opportunity to actually move bulk power from Hydro-Quebec to Michigan using a high voltage DC system. And you'd have a converter station in Quebec, you'd have a converter station in Michigan, and then a high voltage DC line between the two. And that would actually look like a Michigan-based power plant. So what you could do, I mean, you could dispatch, hydropower is pretty much dispatchable. So you could, put the hydropower into this high voltage DC transmission line and then have it serve Michigan residents. So that would be something I think that would, should be looked at. And, having talked with, and actually one of my friends, Dale Osborne, who was with MISO for many years and who has done a lot of study on this, that's something he suggested to me a long time ago that Michigan ought to be looking at.
Mhm.
So that would be, I think, a really good opportunity to consider. Now, there are a lot of political considerations going across Ontario and, working with Canada. But, we have a tremendous opportunity here in the US because we are the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have a tremendous amount of solar power in this country. And then we are adjacent to Canada. I mean, Michigan is surrounded by Canada on 3 sides, and Canada has a tremendous amount of hydropower. So we have a lot of diversity of generation, possible generating sources. There's a study has been done by the National Renewable Energy Labs called NERIS, the North American Renewable Integration Study. And it was shelved for years, but it's been brought out into the open now about, the opportunities to provide clean energy and exchange clean energy between the US and Canada. We could send them excess wind and solar power. They could send us excess hydropower. And so we could, trade back and forth as needed. So that's another, I just think connecting with, and we do connect with Canada already. I spent time in British Columbia and they're 90% hydropower. Hydro-Quebec is 95% hydropower. So we have some tremendous opportunities there with Canada to exchange wind and hydropower.
Incredibly interesting stuff, for sure. And we could talk about it for hours, really. But Jim, I wanted to sincerely thank you for, taking the time out of your day to talk with us today, and really tell us about some really interesting stuff happening within the transmission industry.
Well, these are very exciting times for, it's funny because everything has its time, and this is the time for transmission and distribution. And with all the EVs and everything, I mean, it's just a great time to be involved in this. And so I encourage people to get involved and be advocates. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest things we need. We need people to advocate for these types of energy, and to, we need to advocate for steel in the ground. We need to build stuff, and it seems like we find a lot of reasons not to build stuff now. And in my opinion, we need to do a lot more building, and because we have a lot of capability, we know how to do that, but we need to do a lot more of it. So I hope I hope people will advocate for building stuff and to help us electrify our economy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jim, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And once more, thank you so much for hopping on.
That was my pleasure. Thanks a lot for doing this, and I hope we can connect again along the way.